Well, hello, my friends, and welcome back to this, our final lecture of GB 102, Bible Backgrounds. And there was much rejoicing. Yay! In this module, we will be discussing an area known as Galilee, a land which includes a low-lying lake and a marshland at the base of Mount Hermon, and a steady rising mountainous highland just to the north of the Jezreel Valley. We will be referring to these areas as the Sea of Galilee, the Hula Basin, the lower and upper Galilee areas respectively. Now, it should almost go without saying, but this area is important to the discipline of New Testament studies because this is the land where Jesus' early life and ministry took place. And it's far from the urban and religious centers of Jerusalem in the south and Judea. Galilee served as a humble starting point for the incarnate Son of God, a place to begin his work. And so with all of this in mind, let's head out on the trail one last time and see what light the geography of this land can shed on our reading of the biblical text. So let's begin our tour of this region by starting with the lowland areas of the Sea of Galilee and the Hula Basin. Now, historically, this area was considered part of the tribal allotment of Naphtali on the west side and the eastern portion of the tribe of Manasseh on the east. And we should also begin by noting that this area is an area that both in the Old and the New Testament, the expectations, both spiritual and societal expectations of the people in this area are relatively low. Just for an example, in Isaiah chapter 9, the prophet promises that a wonderful light will shine on this once spiritually dark region. Of course, Isaiah is predicting the coming of the Messiah, but note that Isaiah's base assessment of the area is that it's largely under Gentile control, at least according to Isaiah 9, 1-3, and that the people that live there are people walking in darkness. This sentiment is echoed in the New Testament when Philip told his brother Nathanael, "We've found the Christ, we've met the Christ, he's Jesus of Nazareth." And Nathanael voices his skepticism by asking, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And so, all of these points considered, it points to the notion that this area is not very well respected. It's backwoods, even rural, if you will. So let's begin by zooming in on our big map here, and note that the red area is what is called the Sea of Galilee Basin. It's the area that's circled in the box and marked in red. The Sea of Galilee is roughly sea level. It has a roughly sea level plain that's to the north of it, and that plain is called the Hula Basin, and it contains the headwaters of the Jordan River, which and then now sprawling to the south we have the lower Jordan Valley cascading down all the way to the Dead Sea. Now the Sea of Galilee itself is not too large. It's about 13 miles long by 8 miles wide, but it's fairly round, or more, I should say, oval shaped. And this gives the lake a circumference of about 33 miles, meaning that it would take about a good day and a half, maybe even 2 days, to walk all the way around it. And moving our shaded area a little to the north, we'll find the Hula Basin. And this area is sometimes called the Upper Jordan Valley because of the confluence of many streams cascading off Mount Hermon and the Baca Valley begin to swirl and merge until they eventually form the Jordan River. Now, this area is fairly flat and marshy, so you won't find too many settlements here or biblical events that happen at the center of the Hula Basin. All the action happens on the rim, either on the west side or sometimes on the east side. Now, because these marshes make for difficult travel, the entrances and exits in and out of this area, just like the city of Megiddo, will become strategic places to build a fort and a small city to control the area and the land around it. And apparently, according to 2 Kings 15, 29-30, this was the plan of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III when he conquered this area from Israel's king known as Pekah. And this apparently was a preliminary conquest so that he could stage further incursions into the south, into Jezreel Valley and Samaria. So strategically, it's important, but it's not necessarily important as far as cities go. And here we are now zoomed in. The Hula Basin is that green area that's surrounded by the highlands of Bashan to the east and northern Galilee to the west. And also note how quick the shift is from that green color close to sea level to the browns and the yellows that go up around 1,000 and 2,000 feet. This indicates that the walls of the Hula Basin are fairly steep, and they're steep on every side except in the south. And the Sea of Galilee, by contrast, is that blue area that is surrounded by many small fishing communities, if you see all the yellow dots around the sea. And so these towns will constitute the central hub of Jesus' earthly ministry. So here it is. It's week 8. This will be the last time you have to endure it. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Download the thumbnail map. I'll cue the music.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map.
Oh, thank you, map. Your check is in the mail. Anywho, let's define the cardinal points of these two significant regions. The first, the Hula Basin, is in the center north of the map, while the Sea of Galilee is in the central southern section of the map. Now, to the west of this area, we'll find a mountainous region known as Upper and Lower Galilee. We'll discuss that next. And the primary dividing line between these two regions is a low-lying valley known as the Beth Karam Valley. Moving on, to the north and to the east of the Hula Basin, we find Mount Hermon, which rises a good 10,000 feet above the basin, and we find the equally formidable Baca Valley, which lies due north, and that's roughly around 7,000 to 8,000 feet above the valley. So a tall set of mountain and valley barriers to the north. To the east, we find the highlands of Bashan, and to the south we find the Sea of Galilee, and from there the Jordan River begins its long and winding descent into the lower Jordan Valley, and eventually it runs into the Dead Sea. And so, to recap all this, the area of the Hula Basin and the Sea of Galilee. To the west, we find the Upper and Lower Galilee regions. To the north, we find Mount Hermon and the Baca Valley. To the east, we find Bashan, or the Golan Heights, and to the south, we find the Lower Jordan Valley. So, you know the drill by now. Next up, get your blue crayon or pencil, and let's mark the principal waterways that are on this map. Now, the most prominent watery feature is the Sea of Galilee, and again, the importance of this lake cannot be stressed, as numerous passages in the Gospels involve this body of water, either as a place where miracles happen, as a place they travel over, as a place they travel around. You can't really read the gospel accounts without dealing with the fact that the Sea of Galilee is a primary location. And in contrast to the Sea of Galilee, if you move to the north, along the southern end of the Hula Basin, we find a small little lake called Lake Hula. Or I should say, you used to find a small little lake called Lake Hula. In the 1950s, the lake was drained to control the breeding of mosquitoes, so that, by extension, they could control the spread of malaria among human beings. And so, go ahead and pause the video here and make sure you have both main lakes marked, the Sea of Galilee and the Lake Hula. Next up for your blue pencil to color in, we have the Jordan River. Now note that it's cut into two here. The upper portion of the river flows into the northern section of the Sea of Galilee, and the lower portion flows out of the southern end. So keep that in mind, that both of these areas are technically called the Jordan River. It just happens to have a major lake, the Sea of Galilee, splitting it up. And our last waterway for this map, we have the Wadi Yarmouk. And as you may recall, this formed the southern border of Bashan with the land of Ammon. And it runs onto this map from the east, and it merges with the lower Jordan River just south of the Sea of Galilee. So go ahead and pause your video here and make sure you've got them all. The Sea of Galilee, Lake Hula, Upper and Lower Jordan River, and the Wadi Yarmouk. So next, trade out your blue pen for a green one, and let's mark the major roadways that go through this region. Now, the first one we want to note is our very old and dear friend by now, the International Coastal Highway. And as you may recall, this highway split off from the lowland coast to run through the Jezreel Valley, and the path of mildest incline out of the Jezreel Valley brings it here along this road to the Sea of Galilee Basin, and it will go around the western edge of the Hula Basin as well. And this would have meant that these low areas of Galilee would have received considerable international amounts of foot traffic. So go ahead and pause the video here and plot the road as I have shown here, starting at Caesarea Philippi and going to the north, and then going around the Hula Basin to Dan and to Abil, and then south to Hatzor. And then south and out of the Hula Basin, it goes to the Galilee Basin through the cities of Chorazin, Capernaum, Magdala, and Tiberias before heading off to the west, leaving the map towards Mount Tabor and the Jezreel Valley. Next, we have the beginning of a small road that's going to connect the Galilee Basin with the coast, especially the plain of Akko. And this road is known as the Beth Karam Valley Road. Now, you may remember this when we studied the plain of Akko, that the road starts at Akko and it runs to the east off the map. Well, here we see the exact opposite. Here the road begins at Capernaum and it's going to head west off the map, heading towards Akko. Now, the valley, along with its road, are going to be the principal dividing line between Upper Galilee, which runs about 4,000 to 5,000 feet, and Lower Galilee, which runs about 2,000 to 3,000 feet. So keep that in mind, that this road is going to be a major dividing line for this other region that we're going to cover next. And finishing this map off, we're going to want to move on to the principal cities. So in the Lake Hula area, there's 4 cities I want you to know. 3 of them are significant to the Old Testament. That's Hatzor, down in the south there, Dan, which is kind of in the central portion of the Hula Basin, and then Abil to the western edge of the basin. And then there's also one New Testament site I'd like you to know, and that's Caesarea Philippi. That's up in the northern and eastern section of the Hula Basin, and this is the city where the Apostle Peter gave his famous confession that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so there's now 5 cities I want you to know in the southern end of this map, and I want you to mark these as well. Keep in mind that all of these cities are prominent in the New Testament, but they play nearly no role at all in the narratives of the Old Testament. So their primary benefit for knowing them is for reading New Testament materials. So the cities I want you to know here are Bethsaida, to the north end of the Sea of Galilee, Chorazin, to the west of Bethsaida, and then around the ring of the Sea of Galilee we have Capernaum, Magdala, and Tiberias, and these run from, again, north to south, Capernaum, Magdala, Tiberias, respectively. So, all totaled up, your map should look something like this. So I want you to go ahead and pause the lecture here for a moment and fill in any loose details that you may have missed. So moving on, here are the 3 points I want you to remember about the Sea of Galilee Basin. The first is that the entire area is surrounded by a large set of cliffs on nearly every side. The face of these cliffs is known as the El Gor, and they pose a significant block to foot travel in Israel. Because of these cliffs, the land can be governed so long as you can control just a few well-chosen forts along the main roads. And also keep in mind that travel through this area is going to be mostly north to south, as the cliffs along the east and west side can rise up 1,000, 2,000 feet above the basin floor, making east-west travel virtually impossible. And also, these cliffs will play an important role in one New Testament story where Jesus will cast a legion of demons out of a man and into a herd of pigs. These pigs will then run down a set of cliffs that are nearby and drown themselves in the water, presumably the Sea of Galilee down below. Next, I would like to note that the Sea of Galilee is a freshwater lake. So, unlike the Dead Sea, which has no outlet so that the sediments and the salts just keep building up and getting saltier and saltier every year, the Sea of Galilee has the Jordan River both running into it and out of it, taking a lot of those sediments down into the lower Jordan Valley and eventually down into the Dead Sea. And so the result is that the freshwater marine life in this lake thrives. And so the fish caught in the Sea of Galilee also will play a very important role in many New Testament stories. These will include Jesus causing the meat from 2 fish to multiply so that it could be shared among thousands of people, as well as Jesus doing things like helping his disciples catch an unprecedentedly large number of fish after they'd been fishing all night and been highly unsuccessful. Another direct result of the lake's freshwater bounty is that numerous small towns will spring up all around the lake, and all of these towns will have very healthy fishing communities. And just in case you weren't aware of it, several of Jesus' disciples will come from these fishing communities and identify as fishermen. And our last take-home point for this section, and I've been alluding to it all this time, is that Jesus ministered to the people of this area for at least 3 years. He's not just coming in and out of this area once and then he's gone. He will have a permanent ministry presence in this area so long as he's ministering here on earth. And most of Jesus' first disciples were fishermen from this land. And many of the places that Jesus chose to either visit or to temporarily live are going to be the small fishing areas around the lake, like Bethsaida and Capernaum. And also, note that when you think of this area, you need to be thinking humble origins. Fishing, just like subsistence farming, is not a terribly lucrative trade, and so many of the people who come from this area will be suspected by outsiders and outcasts simply because they grew up in the Land of Galilee. Case in point, when the Pharisees of Jerusalem questioned Jesus' prophetic credentials, they're basically asking, can this guy even be a prophet at all? One of their objections is that no prophet comes from Galilee. And this indicates that Jesus can't possibly be a prophet in their eyes, simply because he's come from such a spiritually unattuned place. That is to say, the Land of Galilee. Now, to those 3 points that you learned about the Sea of Galilee Basin, I also want you to get 3 new take-home points for the Hula Basin, so that you'll have those as being distinct areas in your mind. And the first of the Hula Basin points is this, that this roughly sea-level basin has a mountain margin. The foothills of the Anti-Lebanon Mountains form a natural boundary all around the basin, with Mount Hermon looming very large on the northeast side. And also, as mountains will do, these mountains receive a good amount of rainfall and snow during the wet months. So a lot of water runoff will make its way into the basin from off the mountains every year. And where there is mountain water running off, springs, waterfalls, and all sorts of other small streams just begin to dot the landscape. And that is very true of the Hula Basin, as much of the water is carried underground so that the Hula Basin has just numerous freshwater springs that just seemingly pop up from out of nowhere. And because of all of this water, and it's fresh water, it's cold water, it's coming directly off the mountain, the Hula Basin will be very accommodating for several types of unique flora and fauna, especially deer, mosquitoes, and all kinds of waterfowl. And lastly, the Hula Basin is relatively flat, so all of that water, once it comes gushing off the mountains and out of the springs, well, it's just going to hit the bottom of the basin, and there it will stagnate. And it tends to stagnate for a long time. And so this will make the area very marshy. And so in addition to mild unpleasantries such as mosquitoes, it'll also be home to some bigger unpleasant things such as crocodiles. And additionally, if that wasn't bad enough, all of these marshy areas will just make travel very difficult to traverse, especially if you're taking a large amount of equipment or men up and down this area. And so most armies will steer clear of this entire area, focusing instead to travel either along the upper margin areas of Galilee, or if they have to go through the Hula Basin, they'll go around the mountain margin areas and never through the center. So now we're ready to start our last section, and we can turn our gaze about 1,500 feet upwards and to the west from the Sea of Galilee Basin into the Land of Galilee proper. This is an area that's a highland region north of the Jezreel Valley, and it constitutes Jesus' homeland or his youthful stomping grounds. Now, like the Galilee and the Hula Basins, we're going to have to divide this Land of Galilee into 2 sections as well. Upper Galilee, which is the area I have highlighted in red on the map here to the left. And this is a mountainous area. It once belonged to the Israelite tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, and for the most part, it had a very negative reputation as being a backwoods place. And moving on, the next area we want to look at is Lower Galilee, and it's the area I've got highlighted here in red on the big Levant map now. And this is a lower elevated set of foothills that eventually fizzles out southward into what we would call the Jezreel Valley. And so keep this in mind, that the Land of Galilee, while we're kind of separating it into these two sections, upper and lower, that these are rather arbitrary distinctions. We're simply trying to make use of how the geography lays to set some boundaries. So there we go. Now that we're all zoomed in, you should be able to see two distinct color sets here on the center of the map. The bright yellow and gray areas represent Upper Galilee, and these are the areas that average about 3,000 to 5,000 feet in elevation. Now, there to the south of that, we have brown and green areas, and these can represent the lower foothills of Lower Galilee. And by now, you should also recognize some very common plains surrounding all of these lands. We have the Phoenician and the plain of Acco to the west side of the map. We've got the Jezreel Valley and the beginning of Mount Carmel there at the south end of the map. And we've got two basins we just covered, the Galilee Basin and the Hula Basin there to the east. So go ahead, download and print out the last of your thumbnail maps, get your coloring implements, and let's just sing the song one last time.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map. I'm the map, I'm the map. If there's a place you gotta get, I can get you there, I bet. I'm the map. I'm the map, 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 I'm the map!
So, like always, let's start by getting our cardinal points. Here we've got on our map, we've marked where Upper Galilee is in the tall 3,000 to 5,000 foot range, and we got Lower Galilee down there below in the 1,000 to 2,000 foot range. And so, to the west, you're going to want to mark the Phoenician plain, which is to the west of Upper Galilee, and the plain of Acco, which is to the west of Lower Galilee. To the south of Lower Galilee, we'll find the Jezreel Valley, and to the east of Lower Galilee, we'll find the Galilee Basin, and to the east of Upper Galilee, we'll find the Hula Basin. To the north of Upper Galilee, we'll find the Lebanon Mountains when we cross the Litani Gorge, and that's going to take us out of our Levant map and into areas of Lebanon and Syria. So next we want to get out our blue pens and start marking all of the bodies of water. And the first one is there in the basin of the Hula Basin, and that's, of course, Lake Hula. After we get to Lake Hula, to the south of that, we have the Sea of Galilee there in the Sea of Galilee Basin. And if you want to, go ahead and mark that in blue. And also take some time and mark all of the cities that we know are around the Sea of Galilee. Chorazin, Capernaum, Magdala, Tiberias, and so forth. And of course, then to the west, we have our old friend, the great big Mediterranean Sea. And that's going to cover all of the western flanks of the map once we go west of the plain of Acco and the Phoenician plain. And let's finish out by getting our well-known rivers. We've got the Jordan River, which will connect Lake Hula and the Sea of Galilee, and that's specifically the upper Jordan River. And then at the top of the map, there we'll have the Litani Gorge, which is, again, our big dividing line between Galilee and the northern country of Lebanon. So now that we've got all of our areas of bodies of water marked out, let's now turn to our pink or purple highlighters, and let's mark all of the mountains and valleys we need to know. And starting off with the mountains, there should be several that you already recognize. We have Mount Carmel there at the southern end of the mountain. We have Mount Moriah there to the southern and eastern end. Just north of that, we have the Mount Tabor. And we have two mountains that you may remember from much, much earlier in the class. We have Mount Taran to the north of Tabor, and we have Mount Meron there to the very north of the map. So those are the 5 mountains you need to know: Mount Carmel, Mount Moriah, Mount Taran, Mount Tabor, and Mount Meron. And then we've got one valley, and that's the valley that will connect the Sea of Galilee Basin with the plain of Acco, and that's the Beth Kerem Valley that I have circled here on this map. Alright, so let's switch gears once again, and let's get out our green pen, and let's mark the big and major highways. And of course, the big one that runs through this whole area is what is known as the International Coastal Highway. And so you'll want to connect all of the following cities, as I have shown here: Dan, Abil, south down to Hatzor, south again to Chorazin and Capernaum, Magdala and Tiberias, and then cutting across to the east, we want to go through the mountains in and down into the Jezreel Valley, cutting through southern Galilee. And then we've got one more road I want you to know, and that is going through the Beth Kerem Valley is, go figure, the Beth Kerem Valley Road. And again, this road will connect the city of Acco with the city of Capernaum on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And that is going to be the main thoroughfare if you're wanting to travel east to west or west to east through this region. Alright, so go ahead and pull out your black markers now, and let's mark all of the major cities we want to know. On the northern end of this, these are in the Upper Galilee area, we really only have one new city. That's the city of Kadosh. All the other cities are things we've seen before. We've got Abil and Hatzor there at the western edge of the Hula Basin, and we've got the city of Tyre there in the Phoenician plain. They're right there on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. So make sure you've got Kadosh and all of these other cities in the area of Upper Galilee that we've already covered. And because the area of Lower Galilee is much more populated, we're going to see a couple old friends as well, but we're going to see some new cities. So starting at the north, we've got Cana right there just south of the Bet Kerem Ridge Road. We've got the city of Sepphoris just below that, there in a valley in between Cana and Nazareth. South of Sepphoris, of course, we have Nazareth, Jesus' hometown. And then to the south there, we have Yokneam, there on the base of Mount Carmel, and the city of Nain, which is mentioned in Luke 7, south and east of Nazareth. And so there you go. Your finished map should look something like this, and if you like, you can also fill in some of the secondary roads as well. So keep in mind, anything that is on this map that I have marked could be on the final quiz. So study away, make sure you've got it all. Go ahead and pause just to make sure you've got it all. And we'll go on with the highlights and take-home points for the land of Upper and Lower Galilee. Alright, so let's move on to the take-home points that we have for the land of Galilee. And we'll start with the 3 take-home points for the land of Upper Galilee. And so the first thing I want you to know is that Upper Galilee is a high and rugged area. Elevations are almost always over 3,000 feet in Upper Galilee, and this is going to make them just really tower over the surrounding plain. For example, in the picture that we have here, we see Mount Meron, and it's just a large looming mountain compared to the valleys that are beneath it. And so what we have here is we also have a mountain area that is close to the coast. And so as storms come from the west to the east, they're going to hit these mountains and they're going to drop all of their rain. And so the area of Upper Galilee, especially on the west side of Upper Galilee, is going to receive a whole lot of moisture. Next, as a result of all that moisture, Upper Galilee is going to develop one of the few hardwood forests in the entire southern Levant area. This area gets over 40 inches of rain per year, and that means that large trees like cedars and oaks and the occasional pine tree are just going to dot this entire landscape. Now, unfortunately, because these trees are so valuable, they've been largely deforested today. But in antiquity, these areas were very, very large forests, and people knew that if you needed to get wood, you had to go to Lebanon or Upper Galilee in order to find these hardwoods. And lastly, the third point for Upper Galilee is that it's a hinterland. That means it's not all that populated. It's an outward lying area, and it's going to have very few cities. The mountains end up being just steep enough that they are not all that conducive to farming. They're not all that conducive to building a city on it. And so what you have is these large forested groves in Upper Galilee that are very good for timber and logging, but you're not going to make many cities. And as we saw on the Upper Galilee map, the only real new city we had in this huge area is the city of Kadosh. And so it's a very fertile area, but people just haven't had the resolve to tame it for human exploitation until the modern times. So those are the 3 points for Upper Galilee. It's a high and rugged land, it's a hardwood forested land, and it's a hinterland with very few cities. So now that you've got that, let's move on to the southern area of Lower Galilee. And in contrast, Lower Galilee is a land of rolling hills, not high and rugged hills. These foothills only come to about 1,000, 1,500, every now and then breaking 2,000 feet. And so the mountains are much, much more shallow. They don't have as deep of an incline. And so people are going to be able to build their cities, their farms, and their towns on top of these mountains, as well as in the valleys beneath them. And so Lower Galilee is going to make much more use of their rolling hills for farmland. And so this area will not be known for trees, but will be known for farms. Now, the second take-home point is that this is also a land of adequate rainfall. It doesn't get as much as Upper Galilee, but it still gets about 30 inches of rain per year. And that means that there's enough rain to grow large trees. There's enough rain to plant successful farms. And so this area, while it's not going to be as successful of a breadbasket as, say, the Plain of Akko or the Jezreel Valley, it will be quite a successful farming area. And our third take-home point, since we're talking about farms, is that Lower Galilee is a land of agricultural valleys. That while the hills might be places where you're going to build your towns like Nazareth, Nain, and so forth, your lower valleys are going to benefit from the fact that there's Eocene and Cenomanian limestone all in those hills, that as the water breaks down those rocks, it's going to leave alluvial soils in all of the valleys. And with as much rainfall as the area gets, these valleys are going to be primary areas for where you're going to build your farms. And so all of the major valleys throughout Lower Galilee, in between all of the mountain peaks that we discussed, like Mount Tabor, are going to be places where it'll be prime real estate for growing crops. So here we are, folks. We've done it. It's the end of the class. So let's take the last 15 minutes and go over our last example of what a final interpretation project could look like. So go ahead and get out your Bibles and turn to Acts chapter 27. In this chapter, we read about the Apostle Paul, who, after a long and protracted legal battle with the Jewish authorities in Judea, found it was necessary that he had to appeal his case directly to Nero Caesar. Now, the imperial governor of the time, his name is Festus, seems like he was more than happy to try to get Paul off of his hands, and he sends him packing from Caesarea sometime around September or October of 59 AD. Now, the majority of this narrative is going to take place on the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, a body of water with a very long history of harrowing sea voyages. And I probably can't stress this point enough, but travel in the deep waters of the Mediterranean Sea was extremely dangerous. Greco-Roman literature is full of stories such as the Odyssey, where storms at sea and shipwrecks are the main natural antagonist, and frequently that the plot of these stories is driven by the fact that there was a storm at sea and we had a shipwreck. And that's what we'll see in Acts 27 as well. It is a story of a shipwreck. Now, even the biblical book of Jonah begins with an account of a sea voyage that turns deadly because of a storm. So keep all of this in mind as we go through this complex passage. We could probably focus on a dozen different theological points, but I'm just going to pick one to focus on for now, and that's going to be this: that God is true to his word, even when circumstances seem to be providing contrary evidence. So, I'd like to begin our assessment of Acts 27 with a theological statement. And the statement is this: when God makes a promise, he keeps it. And indeed, the biblical accounts show God making numerous promises throughout history. Sometimes those promises are uncomplicated, such as at the Battle of Jericho. God promised the walls would fall down if Israel marched around the city for 7 days and blew ram's horn trumpets at the correct time. Israel obeyed, the walls fell down. But some of those promises are a little bit more, complicated. Like, let's take in 2 Samuel chapter 7. God promised to David that his son would build a temple and establish an eternal kingdom. Well, Solomon did indeed build a temple, but the Davidic dynasty was eventually destroyed in 586 BC. And only in the New Testament do we learn that God was still able to fulfill this promise by the ministry and work of Jesus Christ. So I could probably summarize all this by saying, along with the author of the book of Hebrews, that the God who promises, that he who promised is faithful. Now, let's look at one of God's promises that drives this whole narrative of Acts chapter 27. Earlier, in Acts chapter 23, verse 11, we read that the risen and ascended Lord makes a personal appearance to Paul. Apparently, there's no blinding light this time, but Christ promises Paul that he will have to be a witness to the gospel in the city of Rome, just as he had been a faithful witness in the city of Jerusalem. And so, with this promise being made, the question becomes, how's it going to be fulfilled? And I would like to suggest that while we can always take God's faithfulness and his promises at face value, there's usually a couple hiccups from a human perspective, and that circumstances always seem to be threatening the realization of God's promises. And so, a postulate I'd like to suggest is that a person of faith also follows the advice from the author of the book of Hebrews, saying, hold strongly to your confession of faith, even in the midst of a storm. So, let's begin with the obvious. Acts chapter 27 is about a ship that's caught in a storm. So go ahead and pause the video here and read this whole text for yourself. Acts 27, 1 through 44. And once you got the gist of the whole story, we can unpack some added details. So go ahead and read for now. Alright, do you got that? So now, in order to get a better understanding of God's faithfulness in the midst of the storm, we need to unpack a few cultural and geographical facts first. So let's start with the boat that Paul is sailing on and the route he's going to take. Well, actually the text describes two boats, and we know virtually nothing about the first one, save that it was from the city of Edremit, and that's a small port city on the northwest side of Asia Minor. It's just off the island of Lesbos. But this detail does give us one thing to go on. If the ship is leaving the city of Caesarea Maritima, where it's picking up Paul, and it's traveling home to the city of Edremit, it means that if Paul wants to go to Rome, he's got to disembark and get on a different ship somewhere during this voyage. And so, concerning the travel route, let's get a map up here. The first stop is a relatively minor one in the city of Sidon. He's just traveling north up the coast from Caesarea Maritima to Sidon. And here we learn that Paul's guardian centurion, a man named Julius, appears to be a fairly gracious fellow, and he allows Paul to leave the ship and visit his friends who, quote-unquote, attend to his needs. Now, the text doesn't say whether Paul's furlough to go see his friends was under guard or not. But I do find this rather fascinating because it implies that Paul has some very interesting privileges for someone who's a prisoner and under guard for something that, if he's found guilty, he would be put to death. He's being charged with a capital crime, but yet he's being allowed to go visit his friends. So next, after leaving Sidon, the Edremitian ship is going to travel around the coast of the Levant and around the coast of southern Asia Minor until it reaches the port city of Myra in what is called Cilicia. Now, from the first week of class, we learned why this kind of a route was necessary. The winds on the Mediterranean Sea blow from the west to the east. And so a ship trying to travel west must take the very long way around the island of Cyprus. And Luke tells us this much in Acts 27:5, when he comments that the winds were contrary to the direction they were trying to go. And this leads us to a second thing that we can say about Paul's first boat. It's wind-powered. It doesn't have an oar system like a trireme or a Greco-Roman warship that's powered by slaves. It is only powered by the wind. And if the wind isn't blowing the way you want to go, you have to basically hit the wind at an angle and use what little power you do get to go slowly around the coast. So now, in the city of Myra, the centurion Julius is going to find himself a new boat, one that's actually heading to Rome, and the scriptures tell us much more about the second boat. And this allows us to do a proper comparison with the archaeological data and other primary sources to say many more definitive things about the second boat. So let's just start with what we do know just from the biblical text. In Acts 27:7, we know that this second boat is also wind-powered. It doesn't possess a secondary power source like oars. Secondly, we know from verses 10 and 38 that the ship is a cargo ship, and specifically it's carrying a cargo full of wheat. Third, we know from verse 37 that it's a fairly large ship. It has 276 total passengers on board. That's a lot of people to have on a ship. And fourthly, the boat was from the Egyptian city of Alexandria. So comparing these four factors to other ancient descriptions that we have from Roman era, and specifically about merchant ships of that era, the closest match we can find is a grain ship, like the ship described by Lucian of Samosata. So these two descriptions, Lucian's and Luke's, help us to make some reasonable guesses about Paul's boat. One, Lucian describes that the biggest grain ship he ever saw could carry about 700 tons of grain. He's also pretty impressed that this is enough to feed his whole home city for a year. And this boat, he claims, displaces about 1,200 total tons of water. And this figure represents probably our largest possible guess. They may have made larger boats, but we just don't have a description of them. And furthermore, we can learn from ancient documents from Claudius Caesar's reign that shipbuilders were rewarded with extra money if they built a ship that could transport more than 80 tons of grain at a time. And so this sounds like a fairly safe bet for a minimum. So let's just use those rough figures to make some estimates. Let's assume Paul's ship is carrying at least 70 tons of grain. Oh, and keep in mind that this will be 70 to 80 tons of grain that will eventually be thrown overboard to keep the ship from sinking. So compound all of that with modern archaeological research on the remains of Roman-era merchant ships, and we can make an estimate about the total size of Paul's grain boat. When you account for the cargo, 276 people, gear, sails, and everything else, etc., it probably weighs somewhere between 500 and 800 tons fully loaded. Now, these numbers are somewhat problematic. I don't know about you, but I don't usually deal with weights and measures over a few tons. I know my car is about 1.5 tons, and that's about it. So let's search the world and get a visual for this. 80 tons is roughly the equivalent of, what do you know, the NASA space shuttle. And the 500 tons, the lower end of what this boat weighs, is roughly the equivalent of a Boeing 747. And this comparison is actually quite helpful, as our picture on the left shows that these two aircraft, when the space shuttle needs to travel, it will often travel on the back of a Boeing 747. So, got that. About 500 tons total for the boat, and about 80 tons for the wheat, just the cargo. Now picture this. In the middle of the storm, Luke describes the boat as taking on water. And so the crew ends up tossing that cargo of wheat overboard. So picture that, 276 men on the deck of a wooden boat, tossing off bags and jars of wheat as fast as they can in the middle of a storm, in the middle of a torrential downpour of rain. Waves are crashing against the boat. Men are exhausted from going several days without sleep. So picture those conditions, and now picture being told, okay, you've got to pitch 80 tons off this boat, roughly the equivalent of a space shuttle, and you're not just pitching it off with one pitch. You're going to have to do this small piece by piece at a time. How long do you think it would take for 276 men to accomplish this under those conditions? Well, I don't know for certain, but I do know that unlike the picture that I have here on the right of the Boston Tea Party, the sailors having to pitch this grain were probably not doing so with a big smile on their face. So, this Alexandrian grain ship, which weighs at least 500 tons by our estimate, cast off from Myra, but the winds continue to be a problem. The winds are still blowing from the west to the east. And so to deal with these winds, Paul's vessel travels south, probably using the big island of Rhodes and the smaller island of Carpathos as wind shelters until they can arrive at the large island of Crete, here shown on the map. Now, here they stop temporarily in a city called the Fair Havens, and they have a decision to make. Do they keep going on and find a bigger port to spend the winter in, or do they take their chances in the smaller port? And so, a couple questions come up here. Why are the seas becoming so treacherous around this time of the year? Well, Luke gives us a hint when he records, quote, "The voyage was now dangerous since the fast was over," unquote. So as best we can tell, the only Jewish festival that has a traditional fast that every Jew must observe is the fast of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And plugging in some of those numbers, when does Yom Kippur match the later dates when the seas become rough? And the answer is about 59 AD is when the festival happened on October 5th of that year. So Luke is also showing a fair bit of common knowledge about Roman trade and travel on the Mediterranean Sea in general. He knows that from October to January, you've got dangerous traveling conditions and storms are very likely. And furthermore, it may show just how much of a pain Paul has become to Governor Festus. When he left the seaport of Caesarea Maritima, he's not sending Paul on the prime conditions of getting to Rome quickly or safely. He's sending Paul off to the sea when he knows that the sea travel is going to be very dangerous. And who knows, maybe he's hoping Paul is going to get injured or killed in a sea storm. Maybe he just says, you know what, I'm so sick and tired of this problem, I want Paul out of my hair and I don't care if it's going to be dangerous or not. It's hard to say. But I think that we could at least speculate that Paul leaving when he does, and them continuing to travel when they do, suggests that there's a lot more socially going on than just, let's get Paul to Rome. And so with that in mind, let's focus on one of the things that Paul says here in verse 10. He gives a practical warning to the crew while they're at the Fair Havens, and he says, "I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss." And later, when they're in the middle of the storm, Paul's going to repeat this warning, and he's going to say, "You ought to have followed my advice and not have set sail from the island of Crete." And so Luke wants you to kind of understand from his perspective, Paul has some very sound advice to give to the ship captain, to the crew, and to Julius the centurion. It's best if we don't go here. So this raises a question. Why did Julius, a trained Roman soldier, why did he listen to the ship captain and the helmsman and not Paul's advice when Paul's advice seems rather sensible and keeping with Roman common sense that sea travel during this time is very, very dangerous? Well, two possible answers present themselves. And the one is just kind of the social problem. Picture this. When a person receives advice from a trained, seasoned professional or an expert, and then they also receive advice from someone who's a known troublemaker who has no experience in the field whatsoever, which person are you going to listen to most? It'd be kind of like if your grandfather came up to you and said, "You shouldn't get on the internet because if you get on the internet, your computer will get a virus." And then contrast that with let's say, a college professor who teaches computer science, who says, you can use this site, and this site because they're relatively safe. You'd probably trust the college professor about the secure websites he suggested, and the majority of the time, it would be a safe bet. And so this may be what's happening here. Paul, as a convicted prisoner, is saying, we shouldn't go in these potentially stormy conditions. The centurion hears, "Oh, it'll be okay," from the ship captain, and he trusts the expert. That's one possible way to interpret this. There's another way to do this, though, and that just has to deal with the fact that the city of Rome itself has a huge grain supply problem. It's the biggest city in the world at the time, and for example, in Suetonius's biography of Claudius Caesar, we read that Rome frequently suffered grain shortages to feed its huge population. And when these shortages happened, the people rioted. And so, how was Claudius to keep this problem under control? Well, one of the things he's going to do is he's going to offer incentives that will keep the grain coming from Egypt and North Africa even during the winter, even when it's dangerous. And so here's some of the incentives he gives. One, he's going to insure ships. And so if a ship is damaged or it loses its cargo, he's going to say, "You have insurance, I'll cover the cost of the cargo." Additionally, he's going to say things like, if you have legal privileges or Roman citizenship, if you don't have those things, that if you are a part of a grain ship enterprise, you can earn legal privileges, and if you're the owner of the ship, you can even earn Roman citizenship without having to fight in the army. I don't know about you, but that's not a bad deal considering it's a 20-year commitment in the Roman army. And so the captain of Paul's ship may have some monetary reasons for saying, let's keep going. If he could deliver during the winter, he's going to get top dollar for his wheat because fewer ships are arriving in winter. And even if they had a wreck, the ship captain would know his boat is insured. So either way, Paul's divine promise to go to Rome and to preach the gospel now seems like it's been compromised. We know the ship is going to be heading out at a time when it's dangerous. And even Paul says, I perceive we're going to have a problem, folks. And so they're going to leave the port of the Fair Havens, and they're going to try to make for a larger point called Phoenix. This is on the western side of the island of Crete. But before they can get there, a wind is going to blow from off of the island of Crete, and it's going to push them out to sea. And because this wind is a very technical term, let's spend some time and focus on what this term means. All right, so the wind and the storm that is mentioned beginning in Acts 27:14 is called a euraquilo. Now, this is a fairly interesting word because it's a composite word. It's actually a compound word, euro and aquilo, but the word euro is a Greek word. And the word aquilo is a Latin word. And so what this suggests is that there is both Greek and Latin influence, that both Greek mariners and Latin mariners have had to deal with this problem. And it shows the cosmopolitan nature of this kind of adventure, that you have Latin and Italian sailors, you have Greek and maybe even Alexandrian sailors, and they're all coming together, they're all contributing their language, and they have coined a term for this kind of a wind, a euraquilo. Now, the words themselves mean north, aquilo, and euro, east. And so many translators, when they talk about this storm, will just simply call it a northeaster. And some will just transliterate the word euraquilo. Now, that by itself only suggests the direction that the wind is blowing. We also have an adjective attached to this, and that is the word typhonikos, which is where we get our word typhoon. And this implies that the winds are swirling, that it's cyclonic. And since Luke, who's the author of Acts, he doesn't try to define this term any further, it stands to reason that when you say euraquilo, and you're talking at least to ship-going folk, they're going to go, oh, we know what you hit. And again, because it's described so negatively afterward, it makes sense that this term is a foreboding term. When we see the word euraquilo, we are not supposed to think, oh, you got a nice wind. You're going to think, oh man, you guys got the wind. I'm sorry, folks. And so it seems to be a way to address that what Paul is entering, what the ship is entering, is not just unfavorable, but highly dangerous. So, another thing that I find helpful when you have a passage like this that's similar to other passages, and especially if that passage is written by the same author, we can do a comparison and contrast. You see, Luke is the author of the book of Acts, but he's also presumed to be the author of the Gospel of Luke. And so what we can do here is we can compare the similarities to what happens when Jesus and his disciples experience a storm versus what happens when Paul and his associates experience a storm. So the Luke version of the storm on the Sea of Galilee is found in Luke 8:22 through 25. And there's a couple of, I guess, interesting points that make that story stand out, that point to the direction of who is this Jesus guy and what exactly can he do. For example, Jesus initially sleeps through the beginning of the storm when the disciples are basically going, Jesus, Jesus, wake up, we're going to die. He's asleep and they have to wake him up, indicating that either A, this guy is a very, very light sleeper, or B, the storm isn't bothering him, even though it's driven the disciples to the point of going, we're going to die, we're going to die. On the Luke account of the Sea of Galilee storm, the storm begins suddenly, but it also ends suddenly because Jesus will calm that storm with supernatural power. Now, compare and contrasting that, Paul is going to begin also kind of like Jesus in a largely passive role. He's going to interject some advice and some comfort, but like Jesus, he's really not the main focal point of the story when the storm first arises. But some differences, though. The storm lasts about 2 weeks for Paul, whereas the storm in Jesus' trip on the boat with his disciples happens overnight. It happens very quickly. It ends rather quickly. The storm that Luke describes here goes on and on and on for nearly 2 weeks. And one of the things I find most fascinating, the difference between this story and the Luke story, is that no supernatural intervention is recorded. There is an angelic promise that Paul and the rest of his friends and everyone else on the boat is going to survive. But there's no supernatural intervention. The storm will take its toll on the ship, and the storm will win, wrecking the ship on the coast of a small island. And if I'm a reader of Luke and then a reader of Acts, because as far as we can tell, these two books were made to be written or made to be read back to back, I might see there's a storm coming up. Jesus, when he interacted with the storm, simply by the power of his word, says, "Peace, be still," and it's gone. And I may be thinking, a storm is coming up and Paul is on this ship. I wonder what Paul is going to do. And here's where the irony kicks in. Nothing. Paul is not going to pray for the storm to end. Paul is not going to call out to God to do something miraculously supernatural. In fact, Paul is just going to be more of a prophet in the sense as he's going to say, well, here's what the angel told me. But Paul is not going to display any supernatural power of his own. And as a reader of Luke and Acts, you may be scratching your head wondering, why the difference? And while I think we could probably formulate about 3 or 4 probable solutions, here's the one I like the most. The focus on Paul, and Paul being somewhat powerless in this situation, is the point. As God's messenger, Paul is going to have to stand up to the most powerful force in the world, Caesar. And he's not going to be able to just say, God, miraculously make this go away. And so in many ways, the storm becomes a proxy for how he's going to interact with Caesar. That just as Caesar won't just go away by divine power, so the storm doesn't go away by divine power. But yet Paul is going to be a faithful witness through that storm. So let's change up our map here and let's see where this storm takes us, this Euroquello. It's going to blow for 14 days. They're going to do all kinds of things to keep the boat afloat. They're going to run large ropes under it to keep it together. They're going to eventually jettison the cargo, the tackle, and anything else weighing the ship down. And so we've literally tried to drop about probably anywhere between 100 to 200 tons of material off this boat to keep it floating. And even then, we're eventually going to wind up so far off course that instead of getting to a place like Syracuse or Regan, we're going to end up south on a small city or a small island called Malta. And when this happens, the ship will wreck upon a sandbar. It will keep being hit by waves so much that the ship itself will then start to just deteriorate and disintegrate. And eventually, there will be an order given to have everybody swim for shore if you can, or grab a piece of the boat and float to shore if you can't swim. And that's how Paul is going to get to the city of Malta, or to the island of Malta. But even in the midst of this, there's still one more problem to come up. The Roman guards are quite aware if we lose a prisoner, our lives are forfeit. And so the Roman guards will make a plan just before this shipwreck that, well, we've got to kill all the prisoners. Now, the centurion is going to stop them from doing this, and it says specifically he wanted to spare Paul's life. And again, what this shows is what is often referred to as providence. God has made a promise to Paul, but he has not explained how that promise is going to come to pass. And so, Paul is going to get to Rome, but there's a detour to Malta. Paul is going to go and testify before Nero Caesar. And so, one by one, little things will happen to make that come to pass. The soldiers, even though they're planning to kill Paul, will have their swords stayed by the centurion Julius. When Paul's on Malta, he's going to have several other interesting adventures. He'll be bitten by a snake, but he won't get sick. He'll do a healing ministry while he's on the island of Malta, and will give him a chance to spread the gospel there. And so all of this points to a very interesting issue, that Paul, even though he has a promise that he can take to the bank, he still has to navigate the fact that that promise doesn't necessarily come about the way you expect, or that's even the most conducive to what you would want. And so as we close, this brings us to the scandal of the gospel. That Paul has a promise, but that promise doesn't equal security. That promise doesn't equal comfort either. And I hate to have to say it, but this needs to be said over and over again to our culture. Faith in Jesus Christ is not an easy street. Faith in Jesus Christ is not a simple genie in a bottle who will give us exactly what we want. We are promised a cross. And if we've learned anything in this class, you should have learned the cross is a way to die. And this is the scandal of the gospel, that it makes you have to make a choice between living in the world or living for God. And the choice to live for God is a death sentence. But with that in mind, the death sentence is still declared worth it. And I find this to be one of the most compelling aspects of the gospel, that the promise is secure, but the means, how you're actually going to get there to that promise where God will wipe away every tear there at the end of Revelation, is really dependent on your faithfulness and on your ability to stick the course even when things get rough. And I say this to you, my friends, because as students in a Bible college, if this class hasn't done it, other classes will. You will be challenged. You will have your faith stretched and possibly even rebuilt from the ground up based on what you're learning. And so with these things in mind, it may feel like a turbulent storm in your mind. But remember that the promise itself is true. And that truth does not fear inquiry. And so, as Paul says to to the Thessalonians that, yes, you're dealing with persecution. Hold the course. Stay true to your calling. And trust that God will take you exactly where you need to go. And yes, where God takes you may be to a destroyed house like our friend here in this picture. It may be a ruined life. But it is the life that God has planned for you. And lastly, again, just keeping this idea in mind, you may not be successful. Not every one of us is going to get to preach to thousands of people. It's okay. It really is okay to not be successful. Just for an example, Paul spends all this time traveling through the Mediterranean world. He's told to go preach before Nero. And you know what happens? We don't know. But if the church historians have anything to say about this that's even remotely true, Nero didn't buy Paul's argument. He will acquit him, but he'll let Paul go and do one last missionary journey. And when Paul gets back around 68 AD, Nero will have Paul put to death for, once again, getting himself in trouble. Nero will never convert, although he'll hear Paul at least once, maybe twice. And this tells me that if Paul, even though he was promised you will go and preach to Nero, and if Nero doesn't convert, that doesn't mean that Paul's time was wasted. It simply means that God's plan didn't involve Paul's success there. And so, my friends, I pray that you will be able to latch on to that kind of scandal. That God has a plan for you. And I don't know what it is. But whatever that plan is, however good or bad it seems, however many storms pass by, however ruinous it makes your life, latch on, hold tight, keep the faith. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-ba! This presentation was brought to you by F.F. Bruce in his new international commentary on the New Testament, the Book of Acts. It's also brought to you by L. Carson in his Ships and Seamanship of the Ancient World. It's brought to you by a wonderful article by Michael Charles and Neil Ryan called The Roman Empire and Grain Fleets, Contracting Out Public Services in Antiquity. It's also brought to you by Robert Graves' wonderful translation of Suetonius Tranquillus, the 12 Caesars. This presentation is also brought to you by Nicole Hirschenfield, who wrote a very wonderful article called The Ships of St. Paul, Its Historical Background, and a couple other primary texts, such as Lucian of Samosata and his works of Lucian Samosata, translated by H.W. Fowler, and lastly, by G. Rickman, a book entitled The Corn Supply of Ancient Rome, brought to you by Oxford University Press in 1980. My friends, you have completed this course. God bless you. May the Lord richly help you in every endeavor you take. And my friends, know this, that he who has called you is faithful. Be people of faith as well.
Little star and Tico's tree.